so happy that you all are able to join us today. Simone Browne at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm going to have a conversation today on Atlas of AI, this fantastic new book by Kate Crawford. And I just want to let you all know that this is part of a Good Systems. I'm the research director of Critical Surveillance Inquiry, and it's Good Systems is a research area or institute at the University of Texas at Austin. And with Critical Surveillance Inquiry, we work with scholars, organizations, and communities to curate conversations, exhibitions, and research that examines the social and ethical implications of surveillance technologies, both in AI-enabled and not. With a focus on algorithmic harms, we continually question what's good when it comes to AI in order to better understand the development as well as the impact of artificial intelligence. So today, as I mentioned, Kate is here, and I'm just going to give you a short introduction for someone that for many of us doesn't need an introduction, but she is the leading scholar, or is a leading scholar of the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. Her work focuses on understanding large-scale data systems in wider contexts of history, politics, labor, and the environment. She is a research professor of communications in SDS and at the USC Annenberg, a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research in New York City, and she currently holds the inaugural visiting chair of AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Kate's work also includes collaborative projects and visual investigations. Her project, Anatomy of an AI System with Vladimir Angela, won the Beasley Design of the Year Award and is now in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Her collaboration with the artist Trevor Paglin produced Training Humans, the first major exhibition of the images used to train AI systems. Their investigative essay, Excavating AI, won the Ayrton Prize from the British Society of the History of Science. Kate Crawford's latest book, which I'm thrilled to talk to you about, to talk to Kate and for you all to have some time to ask questions after, is Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Cost of Artificial Intelligence. It was recently published by Yale University Press. So thank you for joining us this evening, and I'm ready to go. Kate. Mute.
The classics. We have to start on here. It's not a real Zoom. It's so lovely to see you, Simone. Thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Wonderful. And so as I mentioned to you all that are joining us, the chat is open, not the chat, but the Q&A is open. We'll talk for about maybe 45 minutes and we'll have lots of time for questions. So please make use of it. But I want to just start, what struck me in reading this book was how time figured throughout. The uses of time, control of workers' time at the Amazon Fulfillment Center, time sovereignty, the time that it will take for the Silver Peak mines to be depleted of lithium and then on to Bolivia, deep time, Google's true time. Time was all over the place, but what really stuck with me is that time seems to be running out. This book is so urgent. And you write that the data economy is premised on maintaining environmental ignorance. So can you tell us what this means and how environmental ignorance is really upheld by the data economy?
Well, I mean, first of all, I have to say that, in writing this book, your work has been incredibly formative, particularly your work in Dark Matters and thinking about issues around, watching the watchers, how we think about racialized surveillance, and of course, digital epidermalization, which is, how these technologies, inscribe race, gender, and other characteristics onto the body. So thank you for that work so much, Simone. And to answer this question, around how environmental degradation is always hidden and kept away. I mean, it's in many ways a constant feature of how capital works. The political philosophers Hart and Negri use this idea of the dual operation of abstraction and extraction, that in order to sort of produce these sort of abstract ideals of information capitalism, you have to sort of hide the extractive practices that drive it. And this is particularly true in artificial intelligence because, you know, the technological imaginaries of AI are so ethereal and immaterial and abstract. It's in the cloud, it's sort of math and algorithms. But in actual fact, the opposite is true. You know, AI is a profoundly material technology. So what I wanted to do in this book was to really work against that way in which we hide the sort of material extractions that drive AI from the environment, from labor, and from data, and to really put myself in the places where those extractions happen and to see those operations, to make them less abstract and to make them grounded, if you will. So, you know, that has been a real project here. And it meant doing things like jumping into a van and, you know, going out to the last lithium mine in the United States and sort of seeing how lithium crystal is being extracted from these, you know, desert environments in Nevada, in places like Silver Peak, and really sort of looking at the ways in which these sites represent the kind of the hidden logics of how these systems work. Of course, we need lithium crystal for batteries, which are the backbone of the cloud. And we already know that lithium has this incredibly short time horizon in terms of the, you know, the current reserves that we have. I was just reading a report actually that indicated that depending on if we start to use better recycling methods for lithium, we might be able to use the current reserves up. They will be actually completely exsanguinated by 2100. And if we don't get better at recycling, it could be as soon as 2040. So I was in this landscape sort of thinking about sort of the, you know, the extraordinary stress the planet is on to produce this, you know, vast computational network, and thinking about how we show that. And that was really the motivation behind the atlas.
And I mean, there's the image, one of the images that struck me is the Blair ruins as well. And that is in California, am I right?
It's actually, yeah, it's in that sort of area between Nevada and California, and Blair is up on the hills. It's a ghost town, as they're called, just outside of Silver Peak, and you can sort of climb up into the hills and see these sort of eroded remains of buildings. But of course, Blair was a thriving town for mining. It was a gold and silver mining town where hundreds of people moved to get work, to have sort of cheap land. But because the mining was done at such a pace and all of the cyanide leaching that was going on to extract the ore from the earth, it, you know, poisoned the water and ultimately sort of used up the reserves. So I was standing there in this ghost town looking down on Silver Peak and thinking about, well, how long until this too is sort of rendered completely used up for a series of technical devices that we in many cases only use for between 3 to 4 years before they get thrown away. So in that sense, you know, to bring us back to your excellent question around time, if we think about this from the perspective of deep time, you know, the millions and billions of years that it takes to produce these elements that become the kind of core components of the hardware for AI, we're using up those components for a split second of technological time. And looking at those different scales of time is something that really sort of profoundly changed me as a researcher in this space, and changed the way I look at the sorts of, you know, devices and systems that we use every day.
And these kinds of systems of time, of colonial timekeeping and extraction, replicate themselves. First it's the gold, then it's the lithium, and it's the people, and it's the land, and it's the waterways. And that was something that was, you know, throughout your book, that was really something that stood with me. But I want to go back to the beginning of the book, where you tell us about the concept of observer expectancy effect, and the story of this, you know, horse from Berlin, a seemingly clever horse named Clever Hans. And I've never heard of that horse before, but you use that story to tell us about the role of mythologies, of illusion, of ideology when it comes to artificial intelligence. Can you tell us a little bit about that horse?
Yeah, it's funny because people keep saying, you wrote a book about AI and you start the book with a horse. I'm like, well, there's a reason for this. Well, Clever Hans was a very specific horse, a very famous horse at the turn of the 20th century, who was the toast of Europe. This horse was taken around for sort of public demonstrations of what was seen as exceptional intelligence. So, clever Hans would stand there with his trainer, Wilhelm von Osten, and they would basically, perform this extraordinary show of asking clever Hans questions like, what day of the week is it? Or what's 2 + 2? And Hans would tap out the answer with his hoof on a sort of custom-made board of answers. And it was interesting, the New York Times, I think it was in 1904, said that, clever Hans was so remarkable. This was the horse that could do anything except talk. And so it really was, an extraordinary mass cultural phenomenon. And what happened was that people were very curious what was going on, and they actually staged a commission of inquiry into, was this truly a remarkable horse? And so you had psychologists studying the horse, you had zoologists, you had all sorts of, forms of expertise converging on this one question of, what was being constituted as intelligence here. And what was found was that actually Hans's trainer was entirely subconsciously giving signals to the horse as to what the correct answer was, in some ways overfitting or pre-training the horse to answer particular sorts of questions in particular ways. And this effect is now called the observer expectancy effect, or in machine learning even referred to as the clever Hans effect, which is when you prime a technical system with data that will give you the answer that you're expecting to get. And this happens much more often than people expect in terms of the way that we create technical systems using large-scale training data. So for me, clever Hans is a very rich story of thinking about not just the ideologies of how intelligence is recognized or not recognized, but also stories around how we anthropomorphize this idea of intelligence, which I think brings us to a very dangerous impasse when we think about planetary computation as being somehow similar to human intelligence. This is this original sin in the field where we keep comparing computers somehow to human minds, this Cartesian dualism of like an ideal of disembodied intelligence. Whereas I think the opposite is true. I think, these are systems that are sort of neither artificial nor intelligent in that sort of human sense.
Mm-hmm. And then, it also leads me to think of the kinds of illusions that happen with something like the kind of, or not the illusions, but the way that labor is elided in something like the Mechanical Turk, or the ghost work, or the, as Sarah Roberts' fantastic book, Behind the Screens, tells us about content moderations at spaces like, Facebook and other sites, and that how that labor becomes in some way, made invisible for many. And so this is, again, part of this large kind of lie or alibi or illusion as well.
That's it. I mean, the extractions of labor all along the supply chain of artificial intelligence are extraordinary. And Sarah Roberts' book is a stunning book that everyone should read on that topic in terms of the hidden labor of crowd work. Also, Tarleton Gillespie's work on sort of content moderation. And I'm also thinking here of, in the book I cite, Astra Taylor, who uses this idea of photomation, this idea of it's not really automation, it's ways that we just shift labor to do things to make machines look smarter. And Jathan Sadowski also uses this term of Potemkin AI, sort of creating these sort of fake villages that are supposed to sort of represent technological progress and innovation, whereas in actual fact, they are sort of held together by sticky tape and string, or in the case of AI, by low-paid workers who in many cases are doing the kind of crowd work of labeling data, or of, in some cases actually doing the work of answering what an AI system should be doing. I use the example in the book of a product that was produced by XAI, an intelligent agent called Amy. And you could use Amy as your assistant and ask Amy to sort of calendar appointments for you. But in actual fact, it was crowd workers who are performing Amy. They were sort of getting the messages and doing the work for very, very little pay and very long hours. So, the work of faking AI is actually extremely exhausting and very underpaid.
Mm-hmm. And I kind of like want to talk about labor now. Earlier this month, actually, you wrote an opinion piece for the Washington Post where you talked about bossware, the kind of employment management, almost spyware that many people are under now when they are working from home or so. And it was about the recent, denial of labor rights and labor organizing at Amazon. And so we're seeing this like large proliferation of this kind of workplace management tools, maybe on something like Zoom or other types of spaces. But you warn us that the use of AI systems acts like a force multiplier for the asymmetries of power between bosses and employers. And this kind of bossware seems to be the future of work for many workers, where other workers are now made essential or termed essential, but without essential types of requirements like danger pay, labor rights, health rights, and these things. And so you go even further into your book about your visit to the fulfillment center, the Amazon fulfillment center in New Jersey. And you mentioned that you came across all of these kinds of telltale signs of repetitive stress injuries or accidents or injuries that happen because of the work that is done. So the idea of like someone having a wristband, knees, all of these things. And there were other signs there about resistance and refusal and organizing as well too. And so it's become, there's a lot of, I know about the protest or the harassment of workers that are organizing, but what is it also like inside that space? What are some of the things that you came across and found out?
Yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary experience to be inside one of these gigantic facilities, and they are gigantic. They're the size of, in many cases, 100+ football fields. I mean, they're huge, and Amazon depicts them as sort of the future of labor in that they're semi-automated environments. You have these orange Kiva robots, which are kind of gliding around the factory floor, bringing giant trays of goods to the human pickers who have to pick items and stack them into trays to then be sorted into boxes by an algorithm that's called the Matrix, I kid you not. And that, watching the sort of the human piece of that hybrid environment was actually really shocking. I mean, so many of the workers that I saw, had these, support bandages, were doing very repetitive kind of tasks over long shifts, and they're all put under the sort of algorithmic management pressure of what's called the rate. It's sort of basically the picking rate, the rate at which you should be picking the right object from these giant trays and sorting them. And one of the things that was also really unusual to see was in this particular fulfillment center, they had big screens where it said the voice of the workers, where you could sort of send comments or questions to management and have them answered. And sort of walking around, you'd see scrolling up on these screens, just these really just depressing and heartbreaking tales of people saying, it's, coming up to Thanksgiving, I need time off, how do I do this? And, physically, how are people handling this situation? And the answers on this board were always different versions of, thanks for letting us know, have a nice day. And it was just, the mismatch was just extraordinary. And I'm sure you saw the recent news, Simone, just last week, that Jeff Bezos is now intending to create this new system of very close surveillance of people's ligaments and joints. So almost sort of micro surveillance at the level of the internal workings of the body, to try and sort of spread the load ultimately of what these body parts are doing. So it really is a way of thinking about human bodies as the last mile, the kind of connective tissue that is too expensive or too fiddly for robots to handle themselves. And so I do see this as a metaphor for a broader problem in work generally. Many people sort of see those jobs as being, completely different to their own if they're working in desk work and white collar jobs. But there's actually a really shared problem here, which is how work is being increasingly surveilled down to this very micro level. So yeah, that was the sort of the real purpose of writing that op-ed, is that despite what happened in Bessemer, Alabama, I think there is a great need to be actually finding ways to find solidarity across very different sorts of workplaces to resist this form of bossware and increase surveillance.
And you write that it's not just about not only about, the solid of expanding the definition of tech workers, like we are the service workers, the care workers, the people that clean up within, these kind of tech spaces, but having worker and labor solidarity movements across these, various spaces of work and labor.
Right, and I think that, that is a term that is used by organizers, this idea that we are all tech workers. But I also want to be really careful here that we don't prioritize tech work. How's that audio for you, by the way? I feel like we're getting a little bit of a delay there. Sounding all right? I'll just mic. Sounding okay? Good. Yeah, so I think there's this risk that we keep centering technology as being, either sort of the one great problem or the one great solution. And I want to make sure that on this question of labor, we don't similarly make, we're all tech workers, the idea that means that tech work is the most important once more, and that we're all in some ways, have to be contained within that frame. Because of course, there are many forms of labor that, really are being affected by these sorts of tools. That doesn't mean that everyone is defined as a tech worker. So yes, trying to find those connections and those forms of organizing and solidarity that don't always sort of center technology.
So I have a few of my students, and generally curious people are watching this conversation today, and one thing that struck me. I was saying one thing that struck me. Everything struck me in this book. I was reading like latex. I thought of like cargo ships and all of this. Like, what's happening here? And you get access to some quite secretive or guarded spaces. Whether it's when you drove up close to the NSA data center, or I don't want to give away all of the plot here, but there were some guys in some large Black Suburbans as well too. And so I want to ask really a question about tactics, about your sources and methods. What kind of tips, lessons learned, or ways, any advice for researchers when they want to ask questions or curious about these types of spaces that are often made unavailable or inaccessible?
Great question. And it's, I always say there's so much more out there if you know where to look, that, you don't need to have special access, although of course that always helps. But if you sort of do a lot of the kind of research, yeah, we're getting some weird feedback. We're just getting a response on the chat. I think there might be a mic that's live. I don't know. We'll see how we go. Let us know if you can still hear this. So, for me, it sort of really just meant doing a lot of research, which might seem really odd. So when I was researching Jeff Bezos's reusable rocket base in West Texas, his company Blue Origin is sort of focused on how do you sort of continue growth by using space as the next frontier for extraction. It really meant looking at, where is public land? Where can you go to sort of photograph a facility like that? Sort of knowing where you are within your rights, as a person, to actually engage in this sort of research in public space, and that's increasingly a hard thing to do. And for me, I sort of see that sort of shift where even public space is a place where you can be chased away or made to be feel very uncomfortable. That is a metaphor too for the ways in which all of these public spaces and public resources are being enclosed, and this sorts of the enclosure acts that once did this in terms of property and land is now being done for more and more spaces, from archives to where you might actually go to study a system in a workplace. I mean, it's increasingly difficult, and I think it's so important for researchers to continue to assert their need to be in these spaces and to report what is happening in those sorts of locations. And this is something that I have to say a real genesis of Atlas of AI came from working on Anatomy of an AI System with Vladimir Angela. Like, when we were thinking about how do you begin to understand the full workings of a single Amazon Echo unit, just like one of those little beige cylinders. And we started at the data layer. We looked at how data was being extracted and used, but then we realized, to understand that, you also have to go and see where all the components come from. Where do the semiconductors come from? Where does the plastic come from? That meant going back into the supply chains and really trying to do that research to see where those things came from, all the way through sort of mining smelting, shipping, through to end of life into e-waste tips. And that was really hard, I'll be honest. Like doing that kind of large supply chain mapping is slow and grindy work, but it was so illuminating to us. And for me, it really had this transformative effect. I mean, it was doing that large scale mapping for me meant that if that's like a single Amazon echo, now what I want to think about is how do you do a large scale mapping of the AI industry itself? And so that was really the impetus behind Atlas of AI.
And Atlas of AI, which is a fantastic piece of work, also inspired me or got me thinking. Is really what sent me to. I mean, it sent me like this is kind of colonial imperative of research as well too. But there were researchers there at the University of Ghana that were doing a longitudinal study of the health effects of electronic waste work, and I was so curious about the self-made, self-taught computer engineers that were Frankensteining pieces, together of this near end of life, maybe having 6 months worth of various kinds of, computer equipment. And much of the equipment that's coming now is not able to do that. It's just there for, decommissioning, burning, and getting all of the kinds of particulate earth and minerals that you mentioned in your study here, extracting that from them. So yeah, that was a very, is a fascinating talk about like, where does our waste go? Not only our clothes that we might give to donate to Goodwill, which really gets shipped to these spaces, and they call it dead white men's clothes. And so what happens to like the dead white men's computers that come in these spaces? So what happens when Alexa goes to Accra? Because there are really a lot of health effects from in these spaces that are not only spaces of waste work, but people are living. This is a shopping district. This is a school district as well too. And so we really have a reckoning. I mean, we, the West, or whoever it is that are, about these kinds of technologies, the headphones we buy that are, in 6 months, they're not made useful. They cannot be used anymore. But, one thing that you said just now about finding how to making that map, one thing that the researchers told me was that a lot of the times we don't know where people are using very covert ways of saying something is a bike, but opening it up and it's a set of old computers as a way to ship it, from the UK or the US or other, sites. So there's a lot of like sketchy kind of stuff that we have to continue to be sketchy, and all, immoral kind of things that we have to account for. We who use these things need to account for. So thank you. So I'll let you know how that project goes and the work that they're doing there.
That's fantastic, Simone. Are you going to publish that work? Because that sounds really, really important to hear more about.
It is, it's a research team there, all these kinds of COVID restrictions. What does it mean for me to be vaccinated up and go in a space where people would not necessarily have vaccines if possible in 2024? I mean, those are the kinds of questions I'm thinking about, even in the research that we're doing. What can I do from here? And I think part of having these conversations are part of that, to get us to get to a politics of refusal that you call for at the conclusion of your book. I have so many more questions. Like, so I love the way that you historicize these things and find these interesting stories, events, circumstances. And I had never read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And you use it as a jumping off point. I will definitely be on the list of things to read. But you do this to point to like this pattern of the changing same and of really how power responds to critique. So you can maybe give us a little bit on that book, but the idea that rather than thinking about labor rights, it was about meat processing, food safety, the Food and Drug Administration. And you say that this is like these same kinds of responses are the things that happen with, face recognition technology right now, or other kinds of, ways that people push back and then power pushbacks to really reconstitute itself. So, I also want to talk about facial recognition technology, because that was always something that has been, since I started researching that, I think around 2001, I think these kind of spectacular events is what inaugurated these technologies to be that were already in play. but the use of facial recognition technology as a form of border control was some research that I had done, earlier on in my graduate career. And to see these kinds of changing sames that are continuing to happen now, it's these data sets are like whack-a-mole. Like I'm always interested in what new set Adam Harvey is telling me to go look at to find my old Flickr. I don't even know my Flickr password, but it's being really extracted. Like there's no consent that's happening. I think I'm babbling, but I really want to get to your work on ImageNet and the fantastic project that you did with excavating AI and ImageNet Roulette.
Amazing. Like it's such a rich set of questions, Simone, and let me try and take them in turn and sort of just for a moment reflect on sort of the Upton Sinclair experience of writing The Jungle, which for him, the intended point was to focus on the hardships of working immigrants as part of a broader socialist political vision. And he was inside, sort of the meat packing plants of Chicago. But when it was published, it was essentially provoked this gigantic public outcry about the conditions in which meat was being produced. And actually, again, calls for regulation, which produced the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And this was not his intention. He was trying to look at this broader issue of the sort of exploitation of immigrant labor. But of course, the regulations were the really just the most minor in terms of ensuring sort of food hygiene practices, so that in many ways the operations of capital could continue unrestricted. And I think that is a pattern, I raise this because it's a pattern that I keep seeing in terms of technology time and time again. And we're seeing it with facial recognition, that when we see these calls for regulation for bans, you see in many cases a sort of watering down, a sort of a response whereby, regulation is accepted at the margins to leave untouched the underlying logics of production. And that sort of move that we're seeing time and time again is the one that I think we have to be extremely alert to in this space. Just last night, of course, we saw the EU release a proposal for regulation of AI. And it's over 100 pages, and I'm still very much in the depths of it, but you can sort of see some of those moves again, whereby you can use technologies that I find deeply problematic, like facial recognition and emotion recognition, if you are transparent and you give notice and you say, oh, Simone, we're currently tracking your emotions as you use this video conferencing system, there it is. You don't even have to click a box to say, okay. I mean, these sorts of shifts, I think, are deeply problematic because it makes people feel as though a technology is being controlled, whereas in actual fact, again, those underlying logics remain untouched. So to speak to underlying logics then, you raise ImageNet Roulette, and that came out of a project working with the artist Trevor Paglin. For over 2 years, we just looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the training sets, these sort of substrates that make artificial intelligence systems work. We were specifically looking at computer vision, so visual training sets of images, thousands and sometimes millions of images. And the one set that we spent the most time with, of course, was ImageNet, which is the most well-known sort of benchmark training set for object recognition, which has over 14 million images and 20,000 categories. And those categories themselves came imported from an earlier linguistic training set called WordNet. And what we found was just so shocking to us, not only the ways in which sort of nouns slip from sort of descriptions into judgments. You'd have a category for people that would say, this is for CEOs or for basketball players. And then you start to see sort of racial logics appear in terms of what sort of faces occur in which categories, all the way through to genuinely like misogynistic, horrifyingly racist terms that would, recur as ways of categorizing people. And keep in mind, these are people's images that have been scraped off the internet and just put into these categories by Mechanical Turk workers who are given like the impossible task of categorizing images, often sort of 60 in a minute, into these various classifications, trying to imagine what the designers want them to do. I mean, the whole system raises deep problems in terms of how we're creating ground truth for technical systems, and how politics is freighted in along with those decisions of what is in those training sets, how they're classified, and then how they're implemented. So, that was a real focus, and doing something like ImageNet Roulette, and this is thanks to Leif and Trevor's extraordinary technical team in his studio, was sort of making a system that would allow you to upload your own photograph and to see how you would be classified by the people SYN set within ImageNet itself. And people were, really shocked to see how those logics play out in that very personal way. And I think in some ways this is why artists have been at the forefront of some of these debates around how we engage with training data. People like, Adam Harvey, but also more broadly, I'm thinking of artists like, Heather Dewey-Hagborg and her work around sort of biopolitics and biodata too. Ways that we have to bring these stories and systems into broader public discussions and public debates. And here, Simone, I'm thinking of your work because, of course, you have been researching specifically the way that artists are using these systems, which I think is also going to be an incredibly important contribution. So, I'd love to hear from you in terms of the way in which you see artists actually telling us different kinds of stories about these systems, if I can.
Oh, of course you can. And you mentioned, Heather Dewey-Hagborg's work, and that's what I'm afraid of, is like, what's the next thing beyond facial recognition? And for me, it is the kind of work that she was doing around found DNA. The things that are found, in vivo, like, a cigarette butt, a lipstick on a glass of tissue, all of these things. And it was only, I guess, a couple years after her first initial project on that this, again, it was like Paragon, I think a kind of profiling company, speculative company, would take DNA and then create a face composite based on it. And these kinds of like troubling ways that technology is then given, I think it's what Meredith Broussard calls techno-chauvinism, or the ways that, it's given a certain truth to it when we know that there's so much, shoddy type of science behind it. And of course, those are, of course, long histories. I've been really excited about the work that the artists that I've been in conversation with, that I'm seeing their work, and not only visual artists, but playwrights, poets, and the way that they are offering, some hope, and a hope scenario, and a real kind of engaged and sustained critique of the way that surveillance, if we think of it as the operating system of capitalism, of racial capitalism, of settler colonialism, then they are offering us a way out and doing the heavy lifting, I hope. And I know, and I'm just trying to see if we can put it together, because, that the ImageNet Roulette, I think I was a skinhead, a pyromaniac, but it was a viral moment that got people talking, that might not have even considered the ways that their selfies, their mugshots, and other ways that, parts and pieces of the body, or photographs of the body of scattered around in the internet, that have then become, extracted and used to build these data sets. And so you also do some really important work on affect. And whenever I teach my class, I don't want to say love, because there's such contentious places, but love looking at the airport as a site to think about security theater when it comes to surveillance. And I have them, not a couple years ago, 5 years ago, The Intercept was able to get some documents on the TSA SPOT program. And I have them look at the documents and the various kinds of, micro expressions of guilt, like twitching or touching your nose when you're lying, or sweating too much, or gripping your bag, and all of these ways that, if we think of security theater as a type of performance, and that this is a, based on the war on terror, all of the changes that happened around the airport, there are performances that happen. And part of that is like, how do you produce yourself as a trusted traveler? And they read these documents and they see that, that who gets already, circumscribed as risky, as dangerous, is based on, race, religion, and long histories of those there. And so, the airport, the border, and all of these sites really are governed by anxieties and the production of risk and anxiety. And so you have a chapter on affect recognition, and it's so good. And you historicize it. Like Paul Ekman, he's still around. Of course, he's still around doing that work. But you talk about his work in, Papua New Guinea, and an interesting way in which some of the funding came from ARPA, but they had some some ways that it would also had to do with, anti-Allende opposition in Chile around that time. And so, you pose on a very important question in that chapter, and you ask, why did the idea that there is a small set of universal emotions readily interpreted on the face become so accepted in the AI field? Because this is really a large part of the field right now. Luke Stark writes about this, and you as well. And so it's like, how did that happen? But how can we disabuse people that this is actually there's a universal set of emotions?
Mm. Look, I'm so glad you mentioned Luke's work here, which I think is also a really important way of thinking about the sort of plutonium of facial recognition, and the way that it's now shifting into forms of affect recognition and detection. And airports are a really good site to see how this has played out. As you say, good, a good site, but certainly to see the kind of bare classificatory logics and how they produce, I think, profoundly racialized impacts in terms of who is flagged and who is not flagged. And, multiple studies have shown this. So one of the things I do in the book is really sort of trace the role of Ekman's idea of 6 universal emotions that we all show in our faces, that can be easily detected, not just by people, but by machines. And of course, there are so many assumptions overlaid there that, that emotions can be taxonomized into a small set, that they're the same regardless of who we're talking to or where we are. That a smile means that you're happy. I mean, for any of us who've ever worked in the service industry, we know that that's definitely not the case. Yeah. And yet this idea was so powerful. And so what I did was really sort of trace how it was funded, what the imperatives were, the role of 9/11 in really sort of spiking research in terms of being able to detect or show inner truths of what people might be feeling, which also I think comes from this phrenological impulse, this desire that we see in other tools like the polygraph as well, to try and read the body for sort of internal truths. And and I think it's profoundly problematic, but people have been saying this since the beginning. I mean, I also looked at how Margaret Mead in sort of the early years of Paul Ekman's work was saying, from the perspective of an anthropologist, this idea of universal emotions just loses so much. We lose context, we lose culture, we lose relationality. But the idea remained. And you ask why? Well, in some ways, I think it's because it's what the tools can do. And so this relationship between theory and tools, and the co-construction of theory and tool, is something that I trace through the book. If we have computer vision systems that can record and track micro movements in your face, and if you have a theory that says these micro movements mean the following things, then that's a very tempting thing to apply. And so now you have hundreds and hundreds of papers in computer vision and machine learning that cite Ekman as though it's just fact, rather than really sort of contested work. And interestingly, you mentioned Ekman is still around. He is, and he has in fact now himself become deeply concerned about the way tech companies are creating these systems that claim to offer, deep truths from looking at emotional expressions. And so he too is now like, this is not working. He actually writes to technology companies and says, show me your evidence that this works. And it has not got a reply. So, I mean, so many people are now saying, look, this is something that doesn't work. And yet it is this billions of dollars are sort of behind these systems. So you also write about these ideas in your work, Simone, and I think this is something that, that I think is really important, and I cite in the book, is this belief that we can read race, gender, emotion, even criminality, sexuality from the face and from the body. And that not only is that sort of an attempt at reading, but it also creates a feedback loop where we try to perform to these systems, where you're actually, in a very real way, these systems are making race and gender and emotion and criminality and sexuality, that we're performing these things in order to be legible by them. And so I think that that's something that I keep seeing in the way that these systems actually play out over time, which I think your work speaks to really powerfully.
Like in the early 2000s, the language was still there about phrenology, about these really archaic, should be archaic terms around race and around gender, and around, we know the whole thing about these technologies are, we're talking about facial recognition in particular, we're ill-equipped to identify, read Black women as if there's a gender binary, and so and as you say, they force a gender binary, and so I just keep on saying these are long histories, and like what's next, and the what's next is right here, right now, and it's in the affect technology. You can think about the kind of controlling image of the angry Black woman, or the dangerous a Black child, and how that you don't need a affect, when you have, that's part of like the whole carceral state. You don't need an affect and emotion technology when you have police that read Black children as adults, as already adults. And so it's replicating the same systems that we have, and that's what these technologies do. But it's really, great to see that it requires, these are black box corporations. The corporatocracy almost has to answer to no one. And it's interesting to see that Ekman is now, questioning, where's the data, where's the proof? And I think we all have to have that type of engagement, politics, and interest in, what happens when we, put our Zooms on YouTube, and how is that, going to be used? Because there was a report that came out. I would say it was basically came out on Twitter a couple of years ago, where some researchers realized that they were, some people on Twitter who were also researchers realized that a data set was being created out of YouTube videos of folks that had been using that to form community around transitioning. And so it's publicly available, but does that mean you have consent? And they didn't even, the researchers didn't anonymize these people. They were able to be, misgendered, dead named. And so again, these are the questions that we always, as researchers, as in the university, outside of it, as thinkers, as people that use these technologies, is like, what are our rights and what are our responsibilities to even others that we don't know? Yes. And I think that's the broader kind of community questions that we have to have when you talk about, a politics of refusal here. So we have, I guess, a couple questions in the chat, but I just want to get to your background, because it is, the cover of the book. And I asked that because I was putting, some promo for this online, and I wanted to make it accessible and use the alt text. And I was, how do I name all of these things? You have the latex, the tree that gives us latex. I guess the mountaintop, the cloud, the drone, all of these pieces that come together, and it comes from a long collaboration that you've had with Vladin, that you did the Atlas of AI with. And, collaboration is really a big part of your political project in the work that you do. And so I wanted to maybe to ask that question, but also get to the questions in the chat. Your work to me is so inspirational about dialogue, the artists, the other creators, the researchers, AI Now that you co-founded. It is your research practice, and it is relationality is really what data is about. It's like, how are we going to get out of this if we're not in community with each other? And so, I'm not a fan of like those kinds of, well, what do we do now? Like, whenever you're doing these talks, someone's like, well, what should we do? And use Signal, like, is that gonna, but when it comes to, especially because, this is part of the good systems, and we're questioning what's good, really, and that we sometimes need a hope scenario. And so, what is the hope scenario when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Wow. So look, let me start first by sort of giving a big shout out to Vladimir Angela, who, you know, this is his illustration, part of his illustration for the cover. And it's again, like so much of his work, it's allegorical, and it is so multi-layered in terms of the way the ideas of the book are sort of reflected in these designs. You know, you have, you know, the phrenology head here, sort of gazing through the lens, which is, you know, he thinks about lenses a lot of ways in which AI systems act as lenses. They sort of mediating devices and systems, but often come with their own skews and distortions. And of course, you know, drones and the military logics behind a lot of these systems that I go into in the book also sort of dot the cover. But he also created these beautiful illustrations in the book. So for each chapter, he created an image that conveys some of the kind of core principles there, and they're so beautiful. Again, working with people like Vladimir really sort of changed my thinking and helped me sort of look at systems from many different perspectives. So yeah, it's absolutely, I think for me, a profound way of moving outside of what can be an academic bubble where you're sort of speaking to the same small group of people, and that work and writing in, you know, journals and academic outlets is important, but it can restrict how far these ideas and debates and politics can move. So trying to find ways to work with other researchers, activists, artists, that is where I think we find sort of new ways of actually creating community and creating solidarity. And it's not easy. I mean, that is one of the, you know, the great hard things, but in many ways, that's the work. You know, that's the work that we need to do.
So we have a few questions in the chat, and I want to take one, the first one that came from my colleague Sam Baker, and he asks us, can you tell us more about the specific politics of refusal you articulate at the end of the book? I imagine refusal relates to our attitudes towards bossware and the like, but does it also relate to our attitudes towards refuse, reuse? So thanks for a great talk.
I love this question. Thank you so much, Sam. Yes, I mean, for me, this idea of the politics of refusal has so much within it. And indeed, you know, there are many researchers working on this idea. I'm thinking here of people like Jenna Burrell, who co-hosted an event at Berkeley specifically around politics of refusal recently. And I'm also working on some of these ideas with researchers like Michael Medow and Mike Anany to kind of dig into how do we refuse systems? Because this is not a simple question, particularly when we start thinking about different levels of scale. So with large scale AI systems, you know, take facial recognition. If we have partial bans in places like Oakland or Portland or Somerville, you know, that's partially good for those communities. But then what happens to the many other communities that do not have strong activist networks or ways to sort of push back against technologies that they might find really concerning for them? So how do you scale refusal to meet the scale of you know, these really vast systems? That is ongoing work. There isn't an easy solution. And Simone, I'm with you on this. Like, it would be very tempting to say, well, what are we going to do? Here's an easy answer. There isn't one, but what I will say is this. I don't think this is a question of individual change or consumer choice. You know, this isn't a question where you just, you know, buy the more ethical system or, you know, find better ways to recycle, because ultimately we are looking at some hard limits that represent, for me, the need for real collective action. Now, certainly regulation is one way we get there, but there are a lot of other ways we get there too. And I think for me, that question is really about, what are we going to say is enough? Where are we going to say we actually have to come up with different ways of living? And this is something that you know, Ashila Membe and, you know, others have written about, but that, you know, I cite too in the book, is like, how do we think of a different politics of inhabiting the earth? And these are the kinds of core questions that, of course, do not have easy answers, but that are pressingly urgent now, given that we're already on a planet under crisis. That, you know, that's the scale of questions that we have to be addressing.
And refusal is not just about abandonment or making oneself unavailable, but it's also about, and I'm following Sophia Noble here, the question of repair has to come with reparations. Like this was these was big bucks that continue to be made. And so what does it look like, as she said, to put that, infuse that back into the public or the public commons, and have a reckoning, a truth and reconciliation perhaps for the harms caused by this politics of extraction when it comes to data, artificial intelligence, and other means. So,
exactly. And Ruha Benjamin also in her work uses this idea of like, we are the pattern makers, but we need different patterns. How do we create different patterns of life? And that is a much bigger project, and the work that again has to be done by large communities thinking together.
For sure. And so we have some a couple other questions there. And is there one that you want to choose?
These are all fantastic.
They're all fantastic questions. And so maybe I'll do you have the first two, and then see if we can wrap them all up. So how does the work of photographing and itemizing the body in humanitarian photography and humanitarian enterprise contribute to the field of surveillance? And another one was again on the work of the racialized fallacy of skilled labor and the place of skilled labor in debates about the fear of automation and the idea of robots coming to take our jobs.
Yes. Well, certainly, I mean, sort of the humanitarian piece here is also very big in AI, and the sort of the way that AI has been used in sort of humanitarian contexts often figures the idea of the global south as, the client state to the AI superpowers, and that relationship where data is extracted from, commonly again the global south and countries that are not as wealthy as the US and China and the sort of AI superstates, but are also seen as test beds, as places to test technical systems and to see, their potential downsides and harms. And so we know who is being most harmed by these systems, because it maps those same kind of colonial lines that have been written about for an extremely long time, that are extremely well evidenced, and that in fact are traced by technical networks too, by the undersea cables that show sort of the lines of empire. So that act of photography and of capturing representations of people and ways of life, and then using it to train AI systems, I think does repeat those logics of surveillance that you mentioned. But in terms of this second question around this idea of skilled labor and robots coming for our jobs, what worries me a little bit about the way in which that debate is currently framed is that automation is seen as a sort of a replacement technology, as something that will simply sort of end entire sort of job categories. But what we're seeing more and more, and certainly at the moment, is this sort of infusion of automation into existing job categories to make work certainly more surveilled, certainly more compressed, and in many ways making it sort of ordered to logics that are centralized by management. So there are many people whose shifts, if they're being created by automated systems to benefit a corporation, like when do we need the most people on, when is it inefficient for us to have workers on, the result is that you find people who are unable to even control their own work schedule. They don't know when they have to turn up to a shop or to a factory. It's again this idea of profound asymmetries of power that were pre-existing that are now being amplified by these kinds of algorithmic management systems. So it's a great question. Yeah,
they're all fantastic questions.
Yeah, they're great.
Just also just ping back to the first question, and to often humanitarian efforts, UNICEF, come also with boots on the ground, come also with the violence of structural adjustment policies, and they become, as you're right, the testing ground for something like UNICEF using drones in a drone corridor to get vaccines or other types of goods to folks, as said to be for humanitarian reasons. But we have to think about where does the funding come from? What else is being upheld and supported by those kinds of activities when claims are made that something is humanitarian? This has been a wonderful conversation, and it's been it's been great to see that the lively Q&A, and I would love to continue it, but we have come to our time here. Thank you so much for you all in the audience for joining us here. As you know, Kate Crawford's book is available for you now, and there's also a discount code where you all signed up. So it's a fantastic read, and I think it should be read by everyone, because there is something in that to tell us that we are all not only implicated, but we also have the possibilities to turn this around, because time is really running out. So thank you so much for this wonderful work, Kate.
Can I just say thank you to you, Simone, for being such an inspiration, and it's been such a pleasure sort of working with you over the years. And as some people may or may not know, we met by working with a feminist art collective called Deep Lab, and to see the ways in which so many of the concerns that we've sort of discussed back through Deep Lab are sort of continuing, in some ways amplified by the pandemic. It's just been such a privilege and an honor to get to think through these questions with you.
It's been fantastic, and we're going to keep it going for sure. But for those of you, wherever you are, if in the Zoom space, we are so happy that you can join us, and we're going to say good night or good morning. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Simone.